Hi guys, and welcome back to the People of Sparks. Here we are on Chapter 9, Hard, Hungry Work. When we last left Lena and Dune, Dune has gotten really into Tick Hassler. Lena is feeling left out and lonely. Instead of getting easier as the day went on, work for the people of Ember got harder. It wasn't just the work, it was the heat they had to work in. Every day was hotter than the last. Dune had never felt this warm in his life. It was like being cooked. All the people of Ember felt this way. They sweated. Their skin turned red and stung and peeled off, and the brightness of the sky hurt their eyes. They got terrible headaches. Sometimes one of them would drop to the ground in a faint just from being too hot. At times like these, people thought, this was a dreadful place we have come to. They put their hands over their eyes, missing the familiar darkness. The team leaders tried to be understanding when their workers drooped and fainted. But the people of Sparks were used to the heat. Beside them, the people of Ember seemed like weaklings. A few times, Dune saw the leader of his team press his lips together and drum his fingers against his legs when one of the Emberites had to sit down and rest. Dune's team leader was Chugger Frisk, a big stubble-jawed man who didn't talk much except to give directions. Every day he sent his team wherever it was most needed. Dune did all kinds of jobs over the next few weeks. He dug ditches for the pipes that conducted the water from the river to the crops in the field. He repaired the wagons that hauled the produce home from the fields. He milked the goats out in the goat pasture, and he made sure the water troughs for the oxen were full. He picked fruit, built fences, he planted seeds, stirred vats of soap, and dug chicken droppings into the cabbage field. Except for being so hot, he didn't really mind the work. He was getting strong, and he liked being strong. He liked the feeling the muscles in his arms. He liked the feeling of the muscles in his arms getting harder, and he liked being taller. He knew he was taller because his old pants were too short. The feeling of being a new person in this new world stayed with him. He would be 13 soon, not a child anymore. Work was making him sturdy and ready for anything. Besides, as he worked, he was finding out all kinds of things that he wanted to learn. How did the pumps work that brought the water up from the river to the fields? How was cheese made, and shoes and candles? Where did they get that ice that kept things cold in their big ice house? What were the bushy-tailed animals that scurried up trees, and the long rope-like animals that sometimes stepped out of the grass? He wanted to know how houses were built, and what glass was made of, and how bicycles worked. It was exciting having so much to learn. But every time he remembered that he and his people had less than 6 months to learn it, less than 6 months to master all the skills that they would need to build a town of their own, a worm of fear twisted in his stomach. Chugger wouldn't answer questions. He was too busy giving directions or working. So Dune often asked questions at lunch. Pardon me. Sometimes Ordney answered him. Sometimes Martha did. Ordney's answers were more like lectures, and Martha's were more like boasts. After a while, it was clear that both of them were getting tired of questions, so Dune asked fewer of them. One day, Kenny followed him outside after lunch and stretched up to whisper in his ear. "I can show you where there's answers to your questions," he said. "You want me to?" "Yeah, sure," said Dune. "Right now?" said Kenny. "Okay," said Dune. Kenny led him through the streets of the village, going first to the river and then away from it, along a street that led out away from the house and into the grove of oak trees. "There," said Kenny, pointing ahead. At first, Dune saw only the long line of a roof above the trees. Then the street opened out into a big empty space he could see had once been covered with pavement. Now the pavement was cracked and weeds grew up through it. To the left of this span of pavement stood a huge building, a rectangular structure so tremendous that it could have held both the Ember School and the Gathering Hall. At the end, facing them, were two massive wooden doors, which Kenny walked towards. "In the ancient days," Kenny said, "you didn't have to open these. They were made of glass and had like these eyes, and they would open as soon as they saw you." "What? That can't be," said Dune. "It was, though." So what do you think he's talking about? Think about it. Have you ever walked up to a door and it like glass doors, and it seemed like it had eyes. It knew when you walked up, and it opened automatically. Maybe that's what he's talking about. Above the doors, there was a sign missing most of its letters. It was a long sign, so you could tell whatever it used to say was a long word. But now all it said was, OOP, ARC. You see that? I wonder what that could be. What does that mean? Dune asked, pointing to the sign. I don't know, Kenny said. We just call it the Ark. It's our storehouse. We're going around to the back. He led the way around to the side of the building to a small door in the back wall which he opened. He opened the door in the back. He had to push hard because something was behind the door, had to be shoved out of the way. Dune peered into the darkness. At first he couldn't make out what he was seeing. Lumpy mountains seemed to fill the room to the ceiling and spread from wall to wall. He took a step forward, but his foot jammed against something hard on the floor. There's answers to everything in here, said Kenny. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, Dune saw that the room was full of, was it boxes? No, they almost looked like books. They lay in toppling stacks, giant heaps, sliding mounds, as if they had just been dumped here from an enormous bucket. Some of them lay open with their pages crumpled. Some were so warped that their covers curved. A smell of ancient dust and mold arose from them. He reached down and picked one up. Its cover was furred with dust. He opened it and saw pages of tiny, neat printing. It was a book, yes, not like the books of Ember. These were much bigger and sturdier, and they had much more writing. He rifled the pages. More dust flew up. But he couldn't tell what the book was about. One page said Chapter XV, The Thermodynamics of Aluminum. He had no idea what that meant. This is amazing, said Dune. Can I take some of them back to the hotel? I guess so, said Kenny. No one will notice. Dune set down the book about thermodynamics. He brushed his smudged fingers against his pants. He felt like a hungry person who had just been led to an immense banquet, far more food than he could eat in his whole life. Is he really talking about eating food? Or was that a metaphor for gobbling up knowledge? He was starving all of a sudden. Not for food, but for the knowledge hidden in these books. He reached out and chose 3 of them blindly, not even looking at the titles. Don't you want some? He said to Kenny. Nah, said Kenny. I already read 4 books in school, and well, that was enough. We learned about history, pre and post. Pre and post? Yeah, pre-disaster and post-disaster. Oh, said Dune. What do you like to do then? He asked. Yeah, just poke around, said Kenny. I poke around in the woods. You could come with me sometime, he said, looking up at Dune with hopeful eyes. Like, if you want. Maybe I will, Dune said, though he was thinking he probably wouldn't. He had so many other things on his mind to do. Besides, Kenny was a little young to be his friend. During the first week after the Emberites arrived, Martha Parton had showed off all of her cooking skills at lunch every day. She made mashed potato pie, fresh peas with chives, walnut croquets, mushroom gravy, cheese popovers, red onion and bean dumplings, scrambled eggs with tomato jam, apricot pudding, and apple butter cookies. Every time she brought in a new dish, she'd say, well, I don't imagine you had these where you came from, or, well, this will be new to you. And the Emberites would say, oh, you're right, we've never had this, and we've never tasted anything so delicious. It's wonderful. And Martha's mouth would crimp into a small, pleased smile. As time went on, however, the food at lunchtime became plainer. Martha got tired of making something new every day to impress her guests. What they found at their dinner and breakfast parcels became less interesting, too. Usually it was just some chunks of cornbread, 10 or 12 carrot sticks, and a few slimy bits of goat cheese. If they were lucky, there might be a hard-boiled egg. Martha took to mentioning, as if it were a little joke, that even though the Partons were given extra food from the storehouse because of the extra people, it seemed as if they had less. Wasn't that odd? Doone started to feel hungry a fair amount of the time, and he knew others did too. His father never spoke of it, but Edward Pocket griped about the food every morning. "Now I know I'm old and small," he'd say, polishing off the last crumbs of both his dinner and his breakfast, "but it doesn't mean I can live on air." One day, Ordney made some disturbing announcements. The cabbage crop, he said, was going to be smaller than expected. Worms had gotten to it. They'd have only about 2/3 of the cabbage that they had had last year. After this, not only was the food at lunchtime plainer, but there was less of it. One week they had string beans, last year's pickled cabbage, and goat's milk pudding for lunch 4 days in a row. And when they opened their baskets at dinner time, they found only a bottle of cold potato soup to serve as both dinner and breakfast. Clary had started a garden just a few days after the Emberites arrived at the Pioneer Hotel. She cleared a patch of ground about 40 feet square, not far from the riverbank, and planted seeds that she had brought from Ember. Children who were too little to go to work in the village helped her pull the weeds and fetch buckets of water from the river. Old people sat in the shade giving her advice. After a while, green shoots appeared in rows on the patch of dirt, and Clary was out there every morning and every evening, tending to them. In several weeks, there would be a little extra food for the people of Ember out of their very own front yard. But it wouldn't be nearly enough. Some people were already grumbling about their skimpy dinner parcels. One night, when Doone was in 215 eating with his father and the others, he heard voices in the hall and went out to see a cluster of people a few doors down. Lizzie was there. Doone spotted the red cloud of her hair. Tick was there too. His voice carried above the rest. "Yeah, well, I got 3 carrots, a plum, and a chunk of sour cheese," he said. "Huh, lucky me. That ought to keep me going for a while." A few people laughed dryly at this. Doone heard Lizzie giggle. "Yeah, it'll keep you going for maybe a half an hour," somebody said. "I don't know how they think we can work with nothing but scraps to eat." Along the hall, the other doors opened, and other voices joined in. "Yeah, well, all I got was some limp green beans and a few clumps of porridge." That's like oatmeal. "Yeah, well, I've had carrot soup 3 days in a row." Some people counseled patience. "Hey, now, we shouldn't complain," someone said. "It's hard for them to give us food. We should be grateful for—" "Yeah, well, I'm tired of being grateful," someone else broke in. "They promised to feed us, but they're starving us instead." "Yeah, well, it seems to me," said Tick, "that we should do something about this. I think maybe I'll mention the problem at lunch tomorrow. Maybe we all should. Maybe we should tell them that it's very hard to work when you're hungry." "I'll tell them!" cried Lizzie's high voice, and then other voices rose in agreement. An excited, angry babble filled the hallway, drowning out those who spoke for patience. "Yeah, I'll speak up. We have to protest. Yeah, Tick is so right." "Tick for mayor!" someone shouted, laughing. For a second, Tick looked surprised. Then his eyes glowed with pleasure. He raised a fist in the air. "We'll stand up for ourselves," he said, and the people around him roared and raised their fists too. Doone turned to his father and Edward and Sadge, who had all come to the door to see what was going on. "We should tell the parsons," he said. "If we're working, we need enough to eat. It's only fair." "Well, of course they don't have to give us anything," said Doone's father. "They're giving us what they think they can spare." He looked sadly at the dried chunk of cornbread in his hand. "But I suppose it can't hurt to mention it," he said. "Without being rude, of course. I imagine that they're doing the very best they can." Mrs. Polster agreed to be the one to bring the matter up. She did so at lunch the next day. They were having cold spinach soup. "I have a request," she said firmly. She set down her soup spoon. Everyone looked towards her. Doone felt a jitter in his stomach. "We have noticed," said Mrs. Polster, "that the food parcels you so generously give us have become considerably smaller lately. We find that when we eat what is within, we are still, to be frank, hungry. This is a difficulty for us." There was silence. Everyone stared at Mrs. Polster, who sat very calmly with her hands in her lap, waiting for an answer. "What?" Mrs. Martha Parton said at last. "Did I hear right?" "Well, I believe so," said Mrs. Polster, "unless you have ear trouble. I said we're not getting quite enough to eat." Martha laughed, a one-note laugh, a laugh of disbelief. "Ha!" Kenny stopped chewing and looked frightened. Ordney drew himself up and cleared his throat. "I am surprised," he said. I had thought you people understood the situation." "Oh, we do indeed," said Dune's father hastily. We're very grateful for what you've done for us. It's just that, well, we're working quite hard," said Clary. "It is a very small amount," said Miss Thorne timidly. "For both dinner and breakfast," said Edward Pocket. "Last night," said Dune, "I had a boiled egg and 3 carrots for dinner, and nothing for breakfast this morning." There was a silence again, a terrible, vibrating silence. Then Ordney leaned up, gripping the edge of the table with his fingertips. "Now listen here," he said. "We are doing the best we can with what has been asked of us. And I must say a great deal has been asked. Suddenly, we're supposed to feed twice as many people as before, more than twice as many." He glared at the Emberites, shifting his eyes to each one in turn. "And yet we do not have twice as much food as we did before. It is true that each family has been given a little extra from the storehouse for this emergency, but not much. Sparks Village just does not have enough for 400 extra people. Are we supposed to feed you instead of our own families? Why should we? Who are you anyway, you strangers from some city that no one's ever heard of?" By the end of his face, Ordney's face was a deep red, and his voice was shaking with rage. Dune felt frozen. All he could think of was, he's right. I mean, of course he's right. But we're right too. Everyone else must have been thinking the same thing. They finished their soup in silence. At the end of the meal, Martha dumped the food parcels on the table instead of handing them out. They each took one, but Dune's father was the only person who said thank you. Later, when Dune opened his parcel, he found a wedge of cabbage leaves turning yellow at the edges and a hunk of some sort of bean cake. His stomach clenched. "They're tired of helping us," he thought. "What are we going to do?" We've got ourselves a bit of an issue, my friends. The people of Sparks are beginning to feel resentment. That means kind of a growing anger. They're growing tired and angry about having to share their resources with these strangers. And these strangers are hungry. And while they're grateful for what they have, it's not quite enough. We find ourselves in a bit of a pickle. That is an idiom to mean we have problems. We'll figure out the solution soon, I hope. And in case you're wondering if you're thinking about the plot line, boop, 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 we're here in the rising action. We've been presented with a problem. We're not at the solution yet. We're not here at the turning point, but we're definitely at the rising action. Where suspense is building, a problem has been presented. I think we've got something big about to happen. The climax is ahead of us. The one big thing! And I can hardly wait. Until next time, guys, happy reading.